Hello, thank you for joining us. The following is a presentation on the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic presented by Bonnie Geyer on behalf of the Hoard Historical Museum and the Fort Atkinson Historical Society in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin.
It was 1918, and the United States was fighting World War I. The war would end late that year, but another deadly enemy, a newly mutated influenza virus, would begin stalking the globe, becoming a worldwide pandemic, eventually infecting over 500 million people and claiming more than 50 million victims, more than the war itself. In the U.S., a quarter of the population, 25 million people, was affected. 675,000 people died, equivalent today to 1.75 million deaths. Influenza did not discriminate. It struck rich and poor, young and old, men and women, Black, white, and Native American. The virus probably started in the United States, spreading explosively around the world and killing more people in raw numbers than any other disease in history before it faded away in 1920. The first 6 months were the deadliest, with 2/3 of the deaths coming then. And what was unusual about this virus is that more than half of the deaths were in people 21 to 30 years of age, rather than infants and the elderly, who are most vulnerable to most influenza viruses, as this graph shows. What was killing these young people was not the virus itself. It was the massive immune response their bodies launched, which filled their lungs with fluid and debris. Influenza killed so many people that life expectancy in the U.S. was lowered by 10 to 12 years. It hit the East and South the hardest. Here in the middle of the country, we were affected the least. Influenza is a viral disease which moves from animals to humans. Because it's endemic, always around, in 1918, Americans at first didn't take this outbreak very seriously. But several times a century, a new influenza virus erupts in nationwide epidemic and global pandemic forms, which mutates so fast the immune system can't react, and which can be far more lethal than endemic forms. The virus attacks the respiratory system, though it indirectly attacks many parts of the body. When influenza kills, it's usually through pneumonia. The victims of the 1918 pandemic were in agony, with delirium, extreme headaches, body aches that felt like their bones were breaking, vomiting, and coughing that tore their abdominal muscles. Their skin darkened from lack of oxygen. They literally drowned from fluid in their lungs. Pockets of air leaking through ruptured lungs formed under their skin so that patients crackled like Rice Krispies. These symptoms spread fear. And there was no cure. Antibiotics cannot cure a viral disease. Evidence suggests this influenza virus began in Haskell County, Kansas. Country doctor Loring Miner, who was nonetheless up to date on the new germ theory, and whose patients said they would rather have him drunk than someone else sober, began in late January of 1918 to see numerous patients with a virulent form of flu. Death claimed the strongest and healthiest. Then, in mid-March, the disease disappeared. At that time, influenza was not a reportable disease. But Dr. Miner thought his experience was so unusual and dangerous that he formally warned national public health officials, who did not then heed his warning. The virus might have died there, but it was wartime. A young soldier came home to Haskell County on leave during the outbreak and then returned to Camp Funston, 300 miles away. Other young men from Haskell County were sent there. That winter was bitter cold, the barracks were overcrowded, and the men huddled around the stoves. By the end of March, over 1,000 men were hospitalized and thousands more needed treatment. 38 died, a tiny fraction of the death rate to come. Meanwhile, men from Camp Funston were sent to other American bases. 24 of the 36 largest Army camps erupted, and 30 of our largest cities, most near camps, saw an April spike in influenza. Generally, this was a mild outbreak. Most recovered. The 1918 influenza pandemic came in 4 waves. Unlike the violent disease that first killed in Kansas, the first spring wave that began at Funston killed few and was largely unnoticed. Due to the mildness of the disease at this time, medical scientists in the U.S. weren't too concerned, but paid attention when it spread across Europe. The second wave, beginning in summer, was lethal. The spread of this virus was directly related to the war and the arrival of nearly a million American troops in Brest, France, where they mixed with French soldiers. When troops of both armies left Brest, the virus spread to Italy, England, and Germany. It then spread to Spain, where it got its name, the Spanish flu. Why? Because Spain was neutral in the war and its newspapers published reports of the virus, unlike the papers in other countries that didn't want to hurt the war effort. The influenza then spread across Europe to India, China, New Zealand, Australia, and elsewhere. This map, foreshadowing the maps we are seeing today, shows the situation on May 31st, 1918, with the United States and Europe hit hardest. There were hints all over the world of the malevolent nature of this virus. The third wave came in November of 1918, when the virus mutated again. And it still killed, though in far smaller numbers. The fourth wave came in 1920, striking cities sporadically, but with enough ferocity to cause 11,000 deaths in New York City and Chicago alone. Medical science was a relatively new field in 1918, and for the first time, modern science was ready to fight back. Beginning in 1900, progressive reforms had advocated for research labs, mandatory reporting, and health education programs. The FDA was created. In 1912, the Marine Hospital Service, established by John Adams in 1798, became the U.S. Public Health Service. In 1901, the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research was established. It later became the National Institutes of Health. In the face of this devastating illness, labs worldwide began to hunt for answers. Scientists worked together to find the cause, to learn how it spread, and to make a serum to cure the disease or a vaccine to prevent it. But the pathology was confusing, and they had little time, weeks, even days, as rapidly as the virus spread. And by the fall of 1918, labs had to function on a far reduced scale. The war had sucked researchers in to examine poison gas, trench fever, and other war-related problems. Researchers in the U.S. were top-notch. They discovered that isolation worked, that those in crowded conditions suffered the most, and that those getting the best care and the most sleep survived at the highest rates. Paul Lewis, a UW graduate, did a quick test of a vaccine which had promising results. The Army Medical School began mass producing a serum for pneumonia. But by 1920, the pathogen was still unknown, and they could only hope that the vaccines would work. The pandemic and its spread was inexorably intertwined with the war, which the U.S. entered in April of 1917. President Wilson had all of the nation's energies focused on the war, not the more dangerous spreading virus. Though Austria and Germany put out peace feelers, Wilson rebuffed them, wanting total victory. Wilson made no public note of the disease. There was no White House or government leadership. Truth was a casualty about both the war and the influenza spreading across the country. Wilson was amassing a huge army, and men were jammed into barracks built for far fewer men. Even though history showed that the biggest killer in war was not combat but epidemic disease, military commanders paid little heed to medical officers who, fearing an epidemic, recommended against overcrowding, the establishment of contagious disease wards, and the isolation of new troops for 10 to 14 days. The Army ignored the advice. Though warned, the Army did not stop movement of soldiers between camps until weeks later, when the camps were paralyzed and tens of thousands of soldiers had died. And as newspapers, public health officials, and the government kept quiet, the virus struck civilians, spreading from shore to shore, often carried by servicemen. In the fall of 1918, General Pershing wanted more soldiers in Europe. And in spite of the growing epidemic, and again against the advice of their own medical corps about transporting troops in the close quarters of ships, the Army ferried 100,000 troops to France. The ships became floating caskets, sickening and killing both crew and passengers who were buried at sea. Even the Secretary of the Navy, Franklin D. Roosevelt, was sick for weeks after traveling on a transport ship. General Peyton March, who made the decision to send the troops, insisted the shipment of troops must not be stopped for any cause. The war would end in a little more than a month, but the damage was done. Camp Devens, northwest of Boston, was an example of what happened on bases across the country and how the virus spread. The barracks at the pier were overcrowded, housing sailors in transit to the war or other bases. The medical staff at the base were knowledgeable, so good that research was being done there. Sick men were isolated and their contacts were traced. But that didn't help in the face of this rampaging virus. Here is how a doctor at Camp Devens described the situation in a letter to a friend dated September 29, 1918. Camp Devens has about 50,000 men, or did have before this epidemic broke loose. This epidemic started about 4 weeks ago and has developed so rapidly that the camp is demoralized. All assemblages of soldiers taboo. These men start with what appears to be an attack of la grippe or influenza, and when brought to the hospital, they very rapidly develop the most vicious type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. A few hours later, you can begin to see the cyanosis spreading all over the face until it is hard to distinguish the colored men from the white. It is only a matter of a few hours then until death comes, and it is simply a struggle for air until they suffocate. It is horrible. To see these poor devils dropping like flies sort of gets on your nerves. We have been averaging about 100 deaths per day. We have lost an outrageous number of nurses and doctors. It takes special trains to carry away the dead. For several days there were no coffins, and the bodies piled up something fierce. It beats any sight they ever had in France after a battle. The Army Surgeon General then ordered quarantine for the sick and an end to transfers in or out of Devens, and the isolation of soldiers from civilians. But again, it was too late. Ships had already taken the influenza to other bases. The same day that the first man was admitted to the hospital at Camp Devens, 300 sailors were sent from Boston to the Philadelphia Navy Yard. Though the commander there quarantined the barracks and disinfected everything, the virus had already escaped to the city. Philadelphia was flooded with people working in factories for the war effort, living in slums with outhouses that served dozens. 4 families would be crammed into one apartment. Raw sewage ran in the gutters. The city leadership was corrupt, and the city health director did nothing, denying in the papers that influenza was a threat to the city and vetoing a quarantine recommended by medical scientists. Why? Because they didn't want to hurt the war effort. A parade to promote Liberty loans in Philadelphia was scheduled for September 28th, and though doctors urged cancellation, newspapers, not wanting to look lacking in loyalty, refused to print the warning. Several 100,000 people jammed the parade route. Civilians began dying in less than 24 hours. In 10 days, the epidemic exploded to hundreds of thousands ill and hundreds of deaths a day. There was crepe hanging on every door. Undertakers were overwhelmed. Hospitals refused patients. Though deaths climbed, city authorities and papers continued to minimize the danger. The city finally acted as fear, starvation, and death in the city grew. Streets were cleaned of rot and excrement. Schools, churches, and saloons were closed. Philadelphia was not alone. Across the country, millions of people went to work for the war effort in factories and cities, where they shared not only rooms but beds, breathing the same air and using the same cups and silver. When the war began, there were not nearly enough doctors in the military, which recruited the best doctors and nurses, leaving a shortage of medical personnel in civilian society. Pleas for doctors and nurses could not be met, even though the Red Cross, a huge player in the effort, tracked down nurses everywhere. Doctors tried everything to treat the virus. Nothing really worked. Influenza could not be prevented by any vaccines developed at that time. The only prevention was to avoid being exposed to the virus. But doctors' advice to avoid overcrowding was ignored. Closing orders didn't work because people still rode streetcars and went to work. By mid-October, the virus was raging. And, as in Philadelphia, not wanting to hurt the war effort, public health officials everywhere minimized the virility of the virus and overstated their ability to control the disease. But people could see for themselves that servicemen and civilians were dying in large numbers. The New York City Health Department announced that there was not the slightest danger of an epidemic. Even Surgeon General Rupert Blue, head of the U.S. Public Health Service, did not initially heed doctors' warnings or prepare for the mushrooming disease, saying, "There is no cause for alarm if precautions are observed." In fact, he actually blocked relevant research and made no preparations to contain influenza. Finally, he asked the Research Council to identify the infecting organism. And finally, he had local papers publish advice, some of which doctors labeled useless and even dangerous. This was one of the notices that was in the papers, and you will see some similarities to what we are hearing today, to cover coughs and sneezes, avoiding crowds, and not using common drinking cups and towels. Here's another ad that appeared in the papers, and you'll notice that this one talks about how the influenza was a problem for war production. And one more notice telling people to avoid careless spitting, coughing, and sneezing. Many public health officials across the country named fear the real enemy, not influenza. Mirroring them, nearly every U.S. paper advised, "Don't be scared, don't worry." Though 8,000 troops at Camp Pike in Little Rock went to the hospital in 4 days, the Arkansas Gazette headlines read, "Spanish influenza is plain la grippe, same old fever and chills." But it was something much more dangerous. On September 27th, one paper reported the truth about the disease, the Jefferson County Union. The general in charge of the Army Morale Branch called the article a depressant to morale and forwarded it to enforcement officials for appropriate action, including criminal prosecution. Not being able to trust what they read was what led to fear in the civilian population. The authorities had lost trust because reports had been diluted with lies. They lied for the war effort and for the propaganda machine Wilson had created. Finally, public officials warned of an outbreak of epidemic influenza with fatalities. Governors and mayors demanded help. And at last, Congress appropriated $1 million for the Public Health Service. But by then, the virus had covered the U.S., beginning on the coasts and working its way to the middle of the country. It even made its way to Alaska and Hawaii. As remote as Alaska was, in 1918, Entire tiny villages were wiped out. October, not April, would be the cruelest month. Asked for help by Rupert Blue, the Red Cross took a leadership role, supplying nurses, establishing emergency hospitals, transporting patients, and providing education. Education, led by the United States Public Health Service and the Surgeon General, was the top priority. The goal was to alert without alarming. The influenza pandemic eroded community life, as people were asked to change the pattern of their lives to prevent the spread of the virus. Work schedules were staggered so public transportation wasn't crowded. Schools, churches, theaters, and places people gathered were closed. Some towns made it illegal to shake hands. Others arrested people for spitting or coughing without covering their mouths. Masks were required. People were afraid to leave their homes. Towns in the West isolated themselves, blocking roads. For the most part, people followed the directives, but there was resistance, especially as the epidemic waned. Families of 5 to 9 children were found alone. Children as young as 7 or 8 were caring for their families. By November, 31,000 children in New York City were orphans. One Kentuckian commented, "Nearly every porch would have a casket a-sittin' on it." There weren't enough doctors, hospitals were full, there was a shortage of caskets and grave diggers. Mourners didn't even have the comfort of a typical funeral, as some victims were buried in mass graves, and some cities banned funerals in churches and public spaces. Poverty increased as wage earners were unable to work, losing wages and jobs, forcing children and widows to go to work. The health of African Americans suffered under the Jim Crow system. Even before this virus, their life expectancy was much lower than white people. Hospital beds were often barred to them. Meanwhile, as the war came to an end, influenza played a role in the final negotiations. President Wilson was meeting in Paris with Great Britain's Lloyd George and Georges Clemenceau of France to set the terms of peace. Both George and Clemenceau had mild cases of the virus. Then Wilson became very ill. He was slower to grasp things, and he became obsessed, believing the home he was in was filled with French spies. Wilson suddenly gave the French and Italians what they wanted: harsh treatment of the Germans, which some felt may have led to the rise of Hitler. Wilson's young diplomatic aides, 2 of whom would become Secretary of State, were disgusted by his capitulation, and Wilson was never the same. And while the war ended, the epidemic continued, and so did the fear. None of the vaccines was effective in preventing or treating the disease, and there was little that doctors could do. Some businesses tried to capitalize on the fear, taking out huge ads in newspapers. Here are a few of those ads. Dr. Mackenzie's smelling bottle, an ad for riding a bicycle, which actually made some sense so that people weren't traveling on group transportation. Racine's Horlicks malted milk got into the mix here, and a suggestion to eat more onions. The pandemic was reflected in popular American culture as well. Years later, Catherine Ann Porter, who fell ill with influenza and lost her fiancé to the virus, gave insight into the experience with her novella, Pale Horse, Pale Rider. Thomas Wolfe's Look Homeward, Angel includes a chapter on the death of the protagonist's brother. Wolfe's own brother died in the epidemic. William Maxwell's They Came Like Swallows is the autobiographical novella of the influenza pandemic through the eyes of an 8-year-old boy whose mother dies, as did Maxwell's. Appropriately, 2 blues songs tell the story of the virus's impact in the country: Blind Willie Johnson's Jesus Is Comin' Soon and Essie Jenkins' 1919 Influenza Blues. Links to both of these songs can be found on the website here. The influenza epidemic did not spare Wisconsin. During the last 3 months of 1918, nearly 8,500 Wisconsinites died of the flu or related causes, principally pneumonia. But Wisconsin fared better than most states because of the most centralized response in the country. While the flu's impact was debilitating when it arrived here, 40 years of government attention to public health bolstered our response. Back in 1876, the Wisconsin legislature had created the State Board of Health and granted it broad authority for guarding against the introduction of contagious disease into the state and for the control and suppression thereof within the state. In 1918, State Public Health Officer Harper used the powers of the office to blunt the virus's impact. One such power was the age-old practice of quarantining people believed to be carrying contagious diseases. Virtually every public venue other than factories, offices, and workplaces was closed. No other state issued such a comprehensive order, which was facilitated by a statewide system of local health officers established in 1883 by the legislature. With few exceptions, compliance with Harper's measures was extraordinary, as was the level of volunteerism displayed. Across the state, citizens stepped forward to establish makeshift hospitals, work on educational campaigns, and spell exhausted doctors and nurses. Wisconsin's death rate, among the lowest in the country, was 2.91 per 1,000 inhabitants, compared to a national average of 4.39. Milwaukee had one of the lowest rates for any cities of its size. The influenza pandemic of 1918 did not spare Jefferson County either. The Jefferson County Union, published then once a week, gives a remarkable picture of its effect on our residents. During the pandemic's second wave, correspondents from Hebron, Koshkonong Station, Curtis Mills, Cold Spring, and all over our county reported on the rampant flu, deaths, school closings, and more. A look at the newspapers from late September through November of 1918, the time of the second wave, tells a story of great loss. This graph shows how influenza moved through Jefferson County by tracking reports in the paper. You can see on this graph that illnesses peaked on November 1st, whereas flu deaths and school closings appear to have peaked on October 18th. While this graph tells the story in numbers, the Jefferson County Union also painted a picture of an unchecked illness causing entire families to fall ill, doctors to care for 50 or more patients at a time, and schools, churches, and public places to be closed. And lives were lost here. Here are some of their stories. The October 18th edition of the paper included 11 obituaries of local people who died from influenza and pneumonia. Nearly all were in their 20s and 30s. The paper prefaced these obituaries with an unusual announcement headlined, "Many Homes in Deep Gloom," and offered its sympathies. The same paper carried an article informing people that though the flu had abated somewhat in Fort Atkinson, it was worse in rural districts. Hebron seems to have been especially hard hit. Here is an obituary for little Iva McMillan, who was taken by the death angel. The October 25th paper reported the deaths of 2 more children. Gertrude Hine, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Hine, died last Wednesday, October 16th, at the age of 12 years of influenza. From Koshkonong Station, we learn Mr. and Mrs. Paul Beating's little son was taken sick with influenza and died last Wednesday and was buried Friday afternoon at the Otter Creek Cemetery. He was the youngest of 7 children. The sorrowing parents have the sympathy of their many friends. In the same edition of the paper, a headline read, "Flu subsides, but closing ban likely to be continued." The article goes on to say, the epidemic of influenza in and about Fort Atkinson is at this writing fairly well in check, and another week ought to almost entirely close out the disease. But it was not over, and more lives would soon be lost here. The following week, the correspondent from Lake Mills alone reported 4 deaths from influenza. One death left a little daughter to comfort the bereaved husband. A father's death left a widow and infant child. That week, Johnson Creek reported its first death, 22-year-old Otto Staudy, whose story highlights what we have learned about the victims of this virus. The paper wrote that he came down with the flu about a week before his death, and although the best of medical attention was given him, he grew weaker until the end came. Otto was a member of the demographic most likely to die from the flu, and the disease progressed quickly, killing him in a week. Another widow and child were left behind. And a week later, Otto's brother died. The situation was obviously serious, and the city of Fort Atkinson had stepped in, closing schools, theaters, churches, and other places people congregate. The health department recommended that clubs postpone meetings. Mrs. H.L. Hoard, president of the Tuesday Club, suspended meetings for the year, the only time the club hasn't met since it was formed in 1881. Even the Red Cross workers stopped meeting. This is an example of an event that was postponed during this period. It was meant to recognize the work that had been done by the Boys and Girls Garden and Poultry Clubs and the girls' canning teams in the county. A jump rope rhyme that was popular during the epidemic goes, "I had a little bird, its name was Enza. I opened the window in influenza." But children weren't jumping rope at their schools here. Small country schools existed then and started October 18th. The paper listed all of these as closed. Some children made good use of their time off. In Lake Mills, it was reported that several of the boys of this vicinity are enjoying their enforced vacation trapping. Businesses here were also affected by the pandemic. On October 18th, it was reported that over 40 men were absent from their benches at the creamery package plant Tuesday. Most of them were suffering with the grip. On November 8th, 9 area schools announced they were reopening. And Fort Atkinson took the flu lid off, but still suggested common sense precautions. Jefferson County was proactive in dealing with this pandemic. On November 1st, an article in the paper trumpeted the fact that the Jefferson County Council of Defense is the first council in the state to take a hand in the fight against the epidemic of influenza. Knowing no inoculation against the influenza had been found, the council had heard of an anti-pneumonia serum invented by a doctor at Mayo Clinic, which was said to prevent pneumonia from setting in. They contacted the clinic, which sent them enough serum to treat 200 patients at no charge. Earlier, I talked about how the war impacted the spread of the influenza virus and how many enlisted men sickened and died. Each week, the Jefferson County Union published a roll of honor listing soldiers from our area who had died in the war or succumbed to the disease in camps across the country and in France. This roll of honor was published in our paper on October 25th. As you can see, more young men from Jefferson County had died from illness, probably influenza, than from war. Edwin Baldwin is listed there. The October 4th paper reported Edwin Baldwin, who has been seriously ill at the Great Lakes with Spanish influenza, is reported greatly improved. And here you see his death on October 9th, just 1 week later. This seeming recovery, to be followed by rapid deterioration and death, was a hallmark of this virus. December of 1918 seems to have been quieter here, and most schools and churches reopened. But by the end of January through early April of 1919, the time of the third wave, reports of influenza and even deaths began to come in from area correspondents. Whitewater was having a third attack of the flu. Johnson Creek was experiencing another epidemic, this time affecting more children. 60% were out of school. Edward Lentz, 34, from the town of Koshkanon, died of influenza. Cold Spring had entire families ill. From April through August, there were just a few mentions of flu, though one young mother died of the Spanish flu, and an area soldier died in France from influenza. When fall of 1919 rolled around, the State Board of Health was taking no chances. A headline read, "All cases of flu this winter will be quarantined." Influenza did stage a resurgence here in February of 1920. One correspondent wrote, "So many are sick with grip and near flu, we can't mention them all." Schools were closed again, and ladies' societies postponed their meetings. Perhaps H.L. Hoard was ill with the flu when he asked readers of the paper to excuse the shortage of the editorial page because of illness. But this time, deaths were rare. I do not think the flu's reduced potency was due to these ads local businesses ran in the Jefferson County Union. Dr. Weld was evidently a local doctor who shipped his pills all over. And this ad promotes rubbers to dodge the flu. 1920 also saw the beginning of prohibition, which came in for its share of bashing in the Jefferson County Union. The paper reprinted an article from the Baltimore American bemoaning the fact that Congress had voted for prohibition when the best medical thought both in and out of the government recognizes the absolute necessity of the stimulant whiskey to aid in fighting a dread malady. The paper also carried an article about a man with flu who didn't get well until he began drinking the port the doctor prescribed, and which the man happened to have hidden in his basement. The article says the prohibitionists would have danced in high glee on his grave rather than allow him this remedy. Personally, I think it might have been the strychnine and arsenic the doctor was giving him that caused his trouble. And prohibition or not, finally, on February 20th, the paper wrote, "The backbone of the flu epidemic in Fort Atkinson is believed to have been broken." While there are a few mentions after February, the flu here had subsided. In all, 94 people in Jefferson County died from influenza. Many more, of course, had been taken ill. By 1920, the lethal nature of the virus had quickly declined in our country and globally. One theory is that the 1918 virus mutated to a less lethal strain. Or perhaps people developed more immunity. Whatever the reason, it eventually burnt itself out. But it left a legacy. There were many negative impacts. It left orphans, people had nervous breakdowns, there was poverty, heart problems existed, there were charges that the War Department had murdered young men. Wilson betrayed our ideals at Versailles, and there was a failure of science to find an answer to this dread disease. There were also positive impacts. There were plans for international cooperation on health, the restructuring of U.S. public health efforts, emergency hospitals became permanent, and there was a push to establish the National Institutes of Health, though it took until 1928 to happen. And now the world is experiencing the most serious pandemic since the 1918 influenza spread across the globe. The parallels are many. Labs worldwide are once again racing to produce an effective vaccine and treatments for COVID-19. Hospitals in some places have been overrun with patients. Undertakers there were unable to keep up as deaths increased. Advice to avoid catching the virus is little changed from 1918. Avoid crowds, cover coughs and sneezes, wear masks, and wash hands. Many jobs have been lost. Schools, churches, and other places people gather have been closed. And just as in 1918, people have been unable to hold a typical funeral for loved ones. And just as the 1918 influenza pandemic left a legacy, so too will the COVID-19 pandemic. That story is yet to be written.